The categorical imperative is one of the most significant contributions to ethics by the great philosopher Immanuel Kant. It is said that all of Kant's philosophy can be summed up in the single sentence: act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that. It should become a universal law. What does this mean? Let us try and understand this concept with the help of an example. Imagine you are a person who always pays his debts. One day you meet your friend and ask him to lend you $10. You promise to pay back the loan tomorrow. However, while you are returning home, you suddenly remember that you have an important date tomorrow with a girl whom you like very much and for whom you have bought an expensive gift. Now you think to yourself, what if I tell my friend that I am not going to return the loan tomorrow? After all, we all have done this in life. We often borrow small amounts from our friends or colleagues, promising to return it the next day, but never do. We end up spending that money on something else and then forget about returning the loan. The person who lends us money suffers. Moreover, we have actually deceived that person into believing that he would get back his money the next day when we never intended to return it. So what should we do in this situation? Well, the answer is simple. Just don't borrow money from your friends if you know that you are not going to return it. Easy solution, isn't it? But what if you hadn't met your friend that day? What if he had lent you the money and you had spent it on your date without ever intending to return it? This is where Kant's categorical imperative comes into play. According to Kant, we should always act according to that maxim which we can will to become a universal law. In other words, before doing anything, we should imagine that everyone in the world acts according to the maxim that we are following right now. If the result of such universalization is a contradiction, then our maxim is not moral. In our example, if everyone never returned his debts, then no one would ever lend money to anyone, and thus the whole society would suffer. This means that the maxim, I will not return the loan, cannot be a universal law because its universalization leads to a complete breakdown of the credit system, which is essential for the proper functioning of any economy. Therefore, even if we don't intend to return the loan, we cannot justify ourselves by saying, well, we all do it, because if everyone did it, the entire system of credit and loans would collapse, and thus we must always act according to those maxims, which are based on universal laws. Another example that illustrates this idea is stealing. Imagine you are hungry and see a loaf of bread on a nearby table. You are so hungry that you are ready to steal that bread, and no one would ever find out about it. Is it okay to steal in this case? Well, according to Kant, the answer is no. Why? Because if everyone stole when he was hungry, there would be nothing left for others. All goods would be consumed by those who want to take them, and no one would ever produce anything because he knew that someone would just come and steal it, and thus the entire economic system would collapse. This means that even if no one would ever find out about our theft, we cannot justify it because it contradicts the universal law, do not steal. It might seem that Kant's categorical imperative is too simplistic and easy to apply. For example, one could argue that what is stopping us from saying that it is okay to lie if it makes people feel happy? Indeed, if everyone lied, no one would trust each other, and thus the whole society would suffer. But couldn't we say the same about honesty? Would Kant agree to this? Well, yes, he would. Kant's categorical imperative has two formulations. The first formulation that we have already discussed is, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that. It should become a universal law. But there is another formulation of the categorical imperative that takes into account the fact that sometimes lying can be necessary to prevent greater harm. It says, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. In other words, we should never use people merely as a means to achieve our goals. Instead, we should always recognize their intrinsic worth. In our example with a loaf of bread, it is obvious that stealing is wrong because we are violating the rights of the person who owns the bread. But what if instead of taking the bread, we decide to lie to the owner that we are hungry and ask him to give us the bread for free? Are we still violating the categorical imperative by doing this? Well, in this case, we are not violating the categorical imperative because the owner would probably give us the bread out of compassion. That is, he would do it voluntarily. However, if we were to ask him to give us the bread by telling him that we are hungry, we would be manipulating his compassion. We would be using him as a means to achieve our goal, which is getting food, and this would be wrong. This is why Kant believed that honesty is always the best policy, even if it hurts. Of course, in some cases, telling the truth might cause more pain than if we had lied. But by lying, we would be treating people merely as a means to avoid pain, which is never permissible. However, there are also cases where lying is necessary to prevent greater harm. For example, if a person is hiding from his murderer and the murderer asks me, "Have you seen him?" I would be using this person as a means to achieve my goal, which is to protect myself if I were to tell the truth, and this would be wrong. Therefore, Kant concluded that there are some actions that are always wrong, such as stealing and killing, and there are some actions that are always right, such as keeping our promises and telling the truth. However, there are also cases where we have to choose between two bad options, like saving an innocent person or protecting ourselves, and in such cases, we should always choose the lesser evil. But what if we cannot decide which action is less harmful? For example, is it permissible to kill one person in order to save 5 others? Kant argued that in such cases, we should follow our intuition. Of course, our intuition is not a reliable guide in matters of ethics. But if we have exhausted all other possibilities and are left with only 2 bad options, we should do whatever our intuition tells us to do. Some people might argue that Kant's categorical imperative is too rigid and does not take into account the context of the situation. For example, consider the case of a woman who is being raped. According to Kant, rape is always wrong, regardless of whether the rapist is her husband or a stranger. But isn't there a difference between the 2 cases? In the case of a stranger, the woman has probably never met him before and therefore cannot possibly love him. In this case, rape is indeed always wrong. But what about the case when the rapist is the husband? In this case, the woman probably loves her husband and would even be willing to have sex with him. So why is raping her still wrong? Well, because the categorical imperative says that we should never use people merely as a means to achieve our goals. And this applies even to our spouses. If the woman is being raped by her husband against her will, she is being used as a mere means to satisfy his sexual desires, and this is wrong. But if the husband asks her for sex and she refuses, he should respect her decision. As you can see, Kant's categorical imperative provides a simple and clear framework for making ethical decisions. However, as we have seen, it is not always easy to apply. Nevertheless, I believe that it is a good starting point for thinking about ethics and morality. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I would also appreciate if you could give me some feedback. What do you think about Kant's categorical imperative? Do you find it helpful in making ethical decisions? Why or why not? Thank you. The postulate treat humanity as an end is one of the most influential moral principles, articulated by Immanuel Kant, and forms the second formulation of his categorical imperative. It states, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. At its heart, this principle insists on the inherent dignity and moral worth of every human being. To treat someone as an end means to recognize that they possess their own goals, values, and capacity for rational decision-making, and that these deserve respect. Human beings are not objects or tools to be used solely for someone else's advantage. They are autonomous agents, capable of making choices for themselves. Kant draws a sharp distinction between ends and means. Treating someone merely as a means occurs when we use them purely for our own purposes, without considering their own rights, needs, or consent. This can happen through manipulation, coercion, deception, or exploitation. While it is inevitable in life that we sometimes involve others in our plans, for example, hiring someone to do a job, the key is to do so in a way that also respects their autonomy and treats them as a partner in mutual agreement, not as a disposable instrument.